My son sent me a text 1 week before his wedding. Dad, don't come. My father-in-law needs to be the most important person in the room. Your presence will make things uncomfortable. I had paid for everything: the venue, the catering, the flowers. Every single contract had my name on it. I read that message twice. Then I picked up the phone, not to call my son, but to call every vendor on that list. One by one, I canceled all of it. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful you're here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, please note, this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and valuable lessons. Any resemblance to names or places is purely coincidental, but the core message remains deeply meaningful. My name is Walter Greer. I am 68 years old, and I have the hands to prove it. They are wide hands, rough at the knuckles with scars across the right palm from a table saw accident in the winter of 1989. A doctor once told me I had the grip strength of a man 20 years younger. I told him that was because I had never stopped working long enough to let my hands forget what they were made for. He laughed. I was not joking. I spent 40 years as a general contractor in Southern California building homes from the ground up. Not managing, not consulting, building. I poured my own foundations, swung my own hammer, and crawled under more houses than I can count to fix what the previous guy had gotten wrong. I started with nothing but a used pickup truck, a toolbox my father left me, and a stubbornness that my wife Donna said was either my greatest strength or my most exhausting flaw, depending on the day. Donna. God, I loved that woman. She was the one who found the land at Big Bear Lake. We had driven up on a long weekend in the fall of 2017, just the two of us, the windows down the air smelling like pine, and something clean that you only find above 4,000 feet. She spotted the property from the passenger seat and grabbed my arm so hard I nearly swerved off the road. Walter, she said, her voice going the way it always did when she had already made a decision and was just waiting for me to catch up. That's it. That's where we're supposed to be. I told her the land was undeveloped, that we would have to build from scratch, that it would take years and cost more than we had budgeted. She looked at me with those dark eyes of hers and said, "You've built other people's homes your whole life. Don't you think it's time you built our own?" I bought the land 3 weeks later. We broke ground in the spring of 2018. I designed the house myself on graph paper at the kitchen table, making Donna a cup of tea every time she came to look over my shoulder and offer opinions I had not asked for and almost always ended up using. 7 acres along the eastern shore of the lake with a dock I built from reclaimed Douglas fir and a porch wide enough to hold 2 rocking chairs and a life's worth of quiet evenings. I laid every foundation stone personally. I framed every wall. I climbed up on that roof myself at 63 years old, while Pete Calloway stood at the bottom of the ladder, shouting up at me that I was going to break my neck and that Donna would never forgive him if I did. Pete had been my oldest friend for 35 years. We met on a job site in Pasadena in 1988, got into an argument about the correct way to flash a chimney, and somehow ended up friends before the week was out. He lived half a mile up the road from the Big Bear property in a house he had built himself 20 years earlier, and he showed up every Saturday morning during construction with a thermos of coffee and strong opinions about everything I was doing. I loved him for it. We finished the house in the fall of 2021. It was everything Donna had pointed to from the car window that afternoon 4 years earlier. Wide plank oak floors, a stone fireplace tall enough to stand in, windows that ran floor to ceiling on the lakeside so that the first thing you saw every morning was water and sky and the ridge of pine trees going gold in the autumn light. She walked through every room the day we finished running her hand along the walls, and when she finally stopped in the kitchen and turned to look at me, her eyes were full. "Walter," she said, "it's perfect." 3 months later, she was gone. Donna was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October of 2021. It moved fast the way that cancer always does when it wants to take something precious from you. She passed on the 14th of December in the bedroom, with the lake view with my hand in hers, and Pete sitting in the hallway outside because he could not bring himself to leave, but could not bring himself to come in either. I sat beside her for a long time after. The house was so quiet, it felt like a held breath. Outside, the lake was flat and silver, and completely indifferent, the way nature always is when your world has just come apart. I remember thinking that I had built this house for the two of us, and now it was only mine, and I did not know what to do with all that space. Pete knocked softly on the bedroom door after a while. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on my shoulder and did not say a single word. That was the right thing to do. Pete has always known when words are useless. It was in that silence, in that first terrible night, that I made the mistake I would spend the next 2.5 years paying for. My son Mason called that evening. His voice was soft and broken, and he said, "Dad, I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm falling apart." And I thought, here is someone who needs me. Here is something I can fix. I had just lost the person I built everything for, and my son was on the phone telling me he was falling apart. And I was a man who had spent his whole life knowing how to hold things together. "Come up this weekend," I told him. "We'll figure it out." He said he would. He did not come that weekend. He called instead and asked if I could help with something small, something financial, just until he got back on his feet. I said yes. I always said yes. Standing on the dock that first morning alone, watching the mist lift off the water as the sun came up over the ridge, I whispered to Donna the same thing I had been whispering every morning since she left. "I'm trying," I said. "I'm still trying." I just did not yet understand what I was trying to hold together and what I should have let go. People always ask what grief feels like. I tell them it feels like carrying wet concrete. Not the sharp, clean pain of a broken bone, nothing that straightforward. It is heavy, slow, and it hardens around you if you stop moving long enough to let it set. I kept moving. That was what I knew how to do. In the weeks after Donna's funeral, I threw myself into the property. I restained the dock. I recaulked every window on the north-facing wall. I rebuilt the stone path from the porch, down to the water's edge, pulling up each flagstone and resetting it in fresh mortar one by one on my hands and knees in the January cold, because the path had developed a slight unevenness over the winter, and because working with my hands was the only thing that kept the silence from becoming unbearable. Pete came by every morning and drank coffee on the porch without being asked. He never told me I was overdoing it. He just handed me a fresh cup whenever mine went cold, and occasionally passed me the right tool before I had to ask for it. That was Pete. 35 years of friendship had made words largely unnecessary between us. Mason called every few days in those first weeks. His voice carried the particular softness of a man performing grief, rather than living inside it. But I pushed that observation away the moment it appeared, because he was my son, and I had just lost my wife, and I could not afford to be suspicious of the last family I had left. He called from his apartment in West Hollywood, always in the evening, always when I was sitting alone in the kitchen with the lake going dark outside the window. "How are you holding up, Dad?" he would ask. "Getting through it," I would say. "How are you?" Honestly, not great. It's hard being down here alone, Mom was always the one who held everything together." He was not wrong about that. Donna had held everything together. The difference was that I was up here in the mountains, rebuilding a stone path, one flagstone at a time, and Mason was down in West Hollywood going to dinner with clients and posting photographs of himself at rooftop bars. I knew this because I followed his Instagram page. I never mentioned it. The first request came 6 weeks after the funeral. "Dad, I hate to ask this," Mason said, his voice dropping in that way it always did when something uncomfortable was coming. "But I'm a little short this month. The market's been weird and 2 deals fell through. It's just a temporary thing. Could you help me out with the rent?" The rent was $2,200. I sent it the same day. The second request came 3 weeks after that. A client dinner he needed to look solvent for $400. Then his car registration, $800. Then a problem with his business account that required a short-term infusion of $5,000 while his funds cleared, which he explained with enough technical-sounding language that I did not ask too many questions. I was a man who understood construction contracts, not financial instruments. I trusted him. Pete noticed before I did. "How much have you given him?" Pete asked one morning in March, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with his coffee mug wrapped in both hands. "I don't keep track," I said. Pete looked at me over the rim of his mug. "Walter, how much?" I did the math in my head. "Maybe 13,000 since December." Pete set his mug down. He rubbed his face with both hands the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "Has he come up to see you?" "Since the funeral?" I opened my mouth and closed it again. "He's been busy." Has he called to ask how you're doing without asking you for something in the same conversation?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a pair of mallards were arguing on the dock. "Pete," I said, I'm asking because I care about you," Pete said. "Not because I enjoy being right." "He lost his mother," I said. "He's struggling." "So did you," Pete said. "And you rebuilt a stone path in January with your bare hands instead of asking anyone for a dime." I did not have an answer for that. I picked up my coffee and looked out the window at the lake, and Pete had the good grace not to press the point any further. He was right, of course. Pete was almost always right about people, which was one of the things I found most irritating about him and most valuable in a friend. The requests continued through the spring and into the summer of 2022. Each one arrived wrapped in a reasonable explanation. Each one was preceded by a version of the same opening line. "Dad, I hate to ask this," delivered in that same carefully softened voice. And each one was accompanied sooner or later by some variation of the sentence that I now understand was Mason's most reliable tool. "Mom would have wanted you to help me, Dad. She always said family comes first." The first time he said it, my chest tightened so hard. I had to grip the edge of the counter to stay steady. Because he was right that Donna believed in family. He was right that she would have wanted me to take care of him. What he understood, and what I was too raw to recognize at the time, was that invoking her name cost him nothing while it cost me everything. Every time he said her name in that context, I did not hear manipulation. I heard Donna's voice and I reached for my checkbook. By the end of 2022, I had given Mason just over $40,000. I told myself each time that it was the last one. Standing at the kitchen window one November evening, watching the last light die on the water, I heard Donna's voice in my head. Not the voice Mason borrowed, but her real voice, the one that had told me for 40 years exactly what she thought without dressing it up. "Walter," that voice said clearly and without apology. "When has that boy ever laid a single brick?" I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and closed my eyes. I did not have an answer for that one either. Mason called me on a Tuesday morning in April of 2023 with the kind of energy in his voice I had not heard since he was a teenager who wanted something expensive. "Dad," he said, skipping past hello entirely. "I need to tell you something. I proposed to Claire last night." She said yes. I sat down at the kitchen table. Through the window, the lake was bright and still, the kind of California spring morning that makes you believe everything is going to be fine. I wanted to feel uncomplicated joy. I tried. What I felt instead was a slow, careful alertness, the same feeling I used to get on job sites when a wall looked straight, but something in my gut said to check it with the level anyway. "That's wonderful, Mason," I said. "Tell me about her." He told me about Claire Whitfield, as though he were reading from a promotional brochure. 27,000 Instagram followers. A lifestyle brand she had been building for 3 years. A father who owned a chain of upscale restaurants across Houston and Scottsdale. He mentioned her father's business before he mentioned what Claire herself actually cared about. I noticed that. I filed it away and said nothing. I met Claire Whitfield for the first time 6 weeks later at a dinner Mason arranged at a restaurant in Beverly Hills called Maison Laurent, a place with no prices on the menu, and waiters who introduced themselves by first name and spoke about the evening's specials the way museum docents talk about paintings. Claire arrived in a white linen dress with her dark blonde hair pulled back and a smile that landed precisely on the middle distance between me and the table behind me. She shook my hand without making eye contact. Her grip was brief and dry, the handshake of someone completing a formality. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Walter," she said, already turning toward the chair Mason was pulling out for her. Gerald Whitfield arrived 4 minutes later and shook my hand, the way men from his generation shake hands firmly with full eye contact. 2 pumps held just long enough to mean something. He was a broad man, not tall, but solid, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of deep tan you earn outdoors rather than in a salon. He sat down across from me and spent the first 5 minutes asking me questions about the Big Bear Lake property, how many acres, how long it took to build, whether I had subcontracted the electrical or run it myself. "Ran it myself," I said. "Licensed master electrician signed off on it, but I pulled all the wire." Gerald nodded slowly, the way a man nods when an answer confirms something he was already thinking. "My father built his own house in Odessa, Texas," he said. "Every nail. Took him 4 years." He paused. "I should have kept that house." Before I could respond, Mason cut across the table. "Gerald, you have to hear about the Whitmore project. I closed it last week. 2.3 million completely off-market." He launched into the story with the practiced fluency of a man who had told it several times, already angling his body slightly away from me and toward Gerald, and the conversation shifted direction the way a river shifts when something blocks the natural flow. I watched Gerald watch Mason. The older man listened, politely asked 2 questions, and then glanced across the table at me, with an expression I recognized, the careful measuring look of a man who was still making up his mind. I gave him a small nod. He returned it. Dinner continued. Claire ordered for the table without asking anyone's preference, and photographed each course before touching it. She spoke primarily to Mason, and when she addressed me, did so with the pleasant, effortful warmth of someone making conversation with a distant relative they expected never to see again. At one point I mentioned that I had built 3 homes in the Pasadena area that had since been featured in architectural publications. Claire said, "Oh, how fun," and redirected the conversation toward the wedding venue options she had been researching. It was after the entrees had been cleared, while Gerald was in the restroom, and Claire was responding to something on her phone, that Mason leaned across the table and spoke to me in a low, urgent voice. He said, his eyes moving briefly to check that Gerald was still out of earshot. I need this wedding to be perfect. Not good. Perfect. Gerald has to see that I'm established, that I'm successful, that I can take care of Claire the way she deserves. He pressed his lips together. I need your help to make that happen. What kind of help? And I asked, though some part of me already knew. The venue we want is $48,000, he said. I can cover part of it, but I need you to help with the rest. The catering, the cars, the decor, I've got a number. It's around $95,000 total. He held my eyes. Mom would have been so proud to see this, Dad. She always talked about wanting to see me settled and happy. The restaurant noise filled the silence between us. Glass on glass, low laughter. The soft percussion of silverware. I looked at my son's face and saw the same boy who had helped me carry lumber on weekends when he was 12 years old, who had sat on the tailgate of my pickup eating sandwiches Donna packed and asking me how I knew where to put the walls. That boy was still in there somewhere behind the tailored jacket and the rehearsed confidence. I believed that. I needed to believe that. Gerald returned to the table, settling into his chair with a quiet ease. He looked between Mason and me and raised his water glass slightly. To family, he said simply. I raised my glass. I said yes to Mason 3 days later over the phone while standing on the dock, watching a hawk circle over the far end of the lake. The moment the word left my mouth, the hawk folded its wings and dropped out of sight below the tree line. I have thought about that a great deal since. There is a particular smell to November at Big Bear Lake that I have never been able to fully describe to anyone who has not experienced it themselves. Pine resin and wood smoke and something colder underneath the smell of the mountain, preparing itself for winter, pulling inward, the way living things do when the temperature drops and the days get short. Donna used to stand on the porch every Thanksgiving morning and breathe it in with her eyes closed, like she was storing it up for later. The Thanksgiving of 2023 I spent on my back underneath a crawl space in San Bernardino. Mason had called 4 days before the holiday. His voice carried the particular urgency he reserved for situations that required my immediate inconvenience. One of his rental properties, a single-family home he managed in the Highland Park area of Los Angeles, had developed what he described as a serious plumbing issue. A possible main line failure. He needed someone he trusted to go take a look before the tenants came back from their holiday travel and found water damage. The plumber I usually use is booked out through December, Mason said. You know this stuff, Dad. It would take you an hour, maybe 2. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent. I drove 2.5 hours down from Big Bear on Thanksgiving morning with my tools in the bed of the truck and Pete's voice on speakerphone telling me I was making a mistake. Go to the property, Pete said. Look at the plumbing. And when you find absolutely nothing wrong with it, call me back. Hi, you don't know that there's nothing wrong with it, I said. Walter Pete said with the patience of a man who has been right about things for 35 years and has learned not to gloat about it. Call me back. The property in Highland Park was a neat craftsman bungalow on a quiet street lined with mature sycamores dropping their last leaves onto the sidewalk. I let myself in with the key Mason had texted me, pulled up the access panel in the hallway, and spent 45 minutes checking every inch of the main line, the branch lines, the P-traps, and the water heater connections. I checked the pressure at 3 different points. I ran every faucet in the house. I got down on my hands and knees with a flashlight in the crawl space under the kitchen and looked at pipe joints that had not been disturbed in 15 years. There was nothing wrong. Not a drip. Not a loose fitting. Not a single thing that could by any reasonable definition be called urgent or serious or worthy of a 2.5-hour drive on Thanksgiving morning. I sat on the back porch steps of that little bungalow and called Pete. "Nothing," I said. Pete exhaled slowly. "Are you surprised?" I rubbed the back of my neck with one hand. My knuckles were dirty from the crawl space, and my lower back ached from crouching, and the afternoon had gone gray and cold around me. "No," I said. "I'm not surprised." "Where's Mason right now?" Pete asked. I pulled up Mason's Instagram on my phone. He had posted 40 minutes earlier a photograph of a beautifully set dining table with candles and crystal and autumn centerpieces captioned, "Grateful for the people who matter most. Happy Thanksgiving." I could see Gerald Whitfield's broad shoulders at the head of the table in the background. Claire was laughing at something off camera. Mason's face was angled toward the lens with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years learning how to look effortlessly successful. I was not in the photograph. I had not been invited to the table. "He's at the Whitfields'," I said. My voice came out flat, and even the way it does when I am working very hard to keep something contained. Pete was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful and low the way it got when he was angry on someone else's behalf. "Walter, he sent you to an empty house on Thanksgiving, so you wouldn't show up at that dinner table. You understand that, right? He didn't want Gerald to spend the evening talking to you." I looked at the gray sky above the sycamores. A crow landed on the fence at the end of the yard, looked at me with one bright black eye, and flew away. My chest felt heavy and pressurized the way it does before a storm moves through that particular fullness that comes right before something breaks open. "I know," I said. "He was afraid," Pete said. "Afraid of what two honest men might say to each other over dinner. Afraid Gerald would see through him if he heard enough of the truth from the right person." I stood up from the porch steps and picked up my toolbox. The tools inside shifted and settled with a familiar weight. 40 years of problem-solving contained in a steel box, and I had driven all the way down the mountain to apply them to a problem that did not exist. "I'm going to drive home," I told Pete. "I'll have dinner waiting," Pete said immediately. "I made a turkey. Doris sent pie." I drove back up the mountain in the dark, the truck's headlights cutting through the pines along the two-lane highway. My phone lit up once on the passenger seat, a text from Mason. "Hope the plumbing wasn't too bad, Dad. Happy Thanksgiving." A turkey emoji followed. I did not respond, but I thought for the first time with real clarity about what Pete had said. Two honest men talking over dinner. Gerald asking the same questions he had asked me at Maison Laurent, quiet, direct, the questions of a man who built his life from the ground up and recognized the smell of real work. Mason had understood something I had not. If Gerald and I sat at the same table long enough, the truth would find its own way into the conversation. Mason could not afford that, and I had spent Thanksgiving on my back in a crawl space so that it would not happen. The drive back up the mountain from Highland Park that Thanksgiving night loosened something in my thinking that had been stuck for a long time. When you spend 40 years in construction, you develop a particular relationship with structural honesty. A wall either bears load or it does not. A foundation either sits level or it does not. You cannot negotiate with physics, and you cannot charm a beam into holding weight it was never designed to carry. I had always applied that same clarity to my work. I had simply never applied it to my son. That changed on the highway home, somewhere between the San Bernardino foothills and the first big curve where the pines close in and the city lights disappear behind you. I started doing what I should have done 2 years earlier. I started looking at the structure. Natalie Greer drove up to Big Bear the first Saturday of December 2023 in a sensible gray Subaru with a travel mug of black coffee in the cup holder and a canvas tote full of manila folders on the passenger seat. She was 35 years old, the daughter of my late brother Carl, and she had inherited Carl's directness and his complete inability to pretend that inconvenient things were not happening. She worked as an independent accountant with a client list that included 3 small businesses, and for the past 2 years, at my request, my personal finances. She had dark red hair. She kept pulled back in a practical bun, wore reading glasses. She was always losing and had a habit of tapping her pen against whatever surface was nearest when she was thinking hard about something. She came up every December to help me organize my tax documents, and she always arrived exactly on time and left exactly when the work was done. I trusted her more than almost anyone alive, which was why I had listened when she suggested back in the spring of 2022 that the arrangement with Mason and the house needed to be in writing. People's memories get convenient. She had told me then, sitting at this same kitchen table tapping her pen against the wood. Especially when money is involved. Especially when it is family money. You need a document that says exactly what this is. I had resisted. Mason was my son, I said. We did not need lawyers between us. Natalie had looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression that reminded me painfully of her father, who had possessed the same gift for communicating volumes without saying a word. She placed a legal pad on the table and slid it toward me. What is the arrangement, Walter, in your own words? I wrote it down. $280,000. Advanced against the purchase price of the property at 1422 Crestwood Drive in Glendale. Mason to contribute monthly payments toward the principal. The advance secured by a recorded deed of trust in my name, meaning that the property could not be sold, refinanced, or transferred without my written consent, and that failure to maintain payments gave me the legal right to initiate foreclosure proceedings. In California, a deed of trust functions as a lien on a property title. It is the same mechanism banks use when they issue a mortgage. I was in legal terms Mason's lender. Natalie had the document drawn up by a real estate attorney and recorded with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office the following week. Mason had signed it at the kitchen table in Glendale, skimming the pages with the distracted speed of a man who had already decided he would never need to read them carefully. He had not read page 3. Page 3 contained the payment schedule and the default provisions. Page 3 was the part that mattered. Natalie spread my December documents across the kitchen table and began sorting them into categories with practiced efficiency. She worked quietly and precisely, and I sat across from her with my coffee, watching the lake through the window and thinking about Thanksgiving and crawl spaces and photographs of dinner tables I had not been invited to sit at. Walter, Natalie said about 40 minutes into the session. Her pen had stopped tapping. That was the first signal. What did you find? I asked. I did not look away from the window immediately. I gave myself one more moment with the view before whatever was coming arrived. Shaku. There is an invoice here from a company called Prestige Event Design, she said. Her voice was professionally level, the way it got when she was delivering information she knew would land hard. $12,000 for additional wedding decor services, ordered in October. She paused. Walter, the signature on the authorization form is yours, but I need you to look at it. She slid the paper across the table. I picked it up and looked at the signature line. The handwriting was close enough that a stranger would not question it. But I had signed my name on thousands of contracts across 4 decades. I knew every angle of every letter. I knew exactly where my pen lifted and where it pressed harder. This was not my signature. It was a careful, studied imitation of it. My jaw tightened. I set the paper down flat on the table and pressed one hand over it as though I needed to keep it from moving. Natalie watched me without speaking, her pen held still in her fingers for once. "He ordered $12,000 of additional decorations," I said, "and signed my name to the authorization without asking me." That is what the document indicates," Natalie said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. She was angry. Natalie did not anger easily, which made it significant when she did. I sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like something breathing. I thought about the wall in the Highland Park bungalow, the one I had pressed my hand against, and known immediately was not load-bearing. I thought about what it feels like when a structure reveals itself honestly. "Pull the Crestwood file," I said finally. "I want to look at page 3. Natalie reached into her canvas tote without hesitation. She had brought it with her. Of course she had. After Natalie left that December evening with her canvas tote and her manila folders and the Crestwood file tucked under her arm, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The invoice with the false signature lay in front of me under the yellow light of the overhead lamp, and I found myself doing something I had not done in months. I started remembering. Not the big moments, not the phone calls and the checks and the Thanksgiving crawl space. The small ones. The ones I had let myself dismiss because dismissing them was easier than understanding what they meant. The first time Mason called my life's work that old cabin, I was standing right beside him. It was August of 2023, 3 months after I had agreed to fund the wedding. Mason had organized a dinner at a rooftop restaurant in West Hollywood, a place called 1130, with a view of the city lights and cocktails that cost more than I used to charge per hour for skilled labor. He had invited 4 of his friends and colleagues, 2 men in finance, a couple who worked in entertainment, and Claire, who arrived 20 minutes late in sunglasses she did not remove until she was seated. I drove down from Big Bear because Mason had asked me to come and because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still believed that being included meant something real. The table was loud and bright, and everyone was attractive in the polished, effortful way of people who had decided that appearance was a professional skill. Mason sat at the center of it, easy and expansive, working the table the way a contractor works a room full of clients, reading what each person needed and providing it. I watched him with a complicated pride. He had not gotten that from nowhere. The ease in a crowd, the ability to make people feel attended to, that was Donna's gift, and he had inherited it fully. One of the men in finance, broad-shouldered Stanford MBA, the kind of confident that never needed to announce itself, leaned across the table and asked me what I did. "Retired now," I said. "General contractor. Built residential and commercial properties across Southern California for about 40 years. His eyebrows went up with genuine interest. "That's serious work," he said. "My grandfather was in construction, poured foundations in Phoenix all his life. Hard as anyone I ever knew." "It's honest work," I said. "You put something in the ground, it either holds or it doesn't. There's no hiding from it." He nodded, leaning forward, and I could see he was about to ask a follow-up question, the kind of conversation that builds naturally between 2 people who respect what real work looks like. Then Mason's voice came in from my left, smooth and quick, sliding between us like a hand closing a door. "Dad builds things, yeah, but honestly, nobody here wants to talk shop on a Friday night." He laughed, an easy social laugh, designed to include everyone at the table except me. "He's retired. He's got a place up in the mountains he likes to putter around. Isn't that right, Dad? Just enjoying the cabin life." The Stanford man leaned back. The moment closed. I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink and looked at the city lights spread out below us and did not say a word. Because I was 67 years old and I had enough self-control not to correct my son in front of his friends on a rooftop in West Hollywood. But I heard it, that old cabin, putter around. As though the 7-acre property I had designed myself, permitted myself, framed and wired and plumbed and finished over 3 years of weekends and vacations, as though all of that were something I had stumbled into in my retirement to keep myself busy, as though it were a hobby, as though it were small. Claire photographed her cocktail and posted it to Instagram before she touched it. The caption, which I saw when I checked my phone in the parking garage an hour later, read, "Friday night views with the best people." She had tagged Mason and both finance guys and the entertainment couple. She had not tagged me. I was not in a single photograph from that evening despite having sat at that table for 3 hours. I drove home up the dark mountain highway and called Pete from the first turnout past the city limits where the signal was still good. "How was dinner?" Pete asked. "He called it that old cabin," I said. Pete was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. In front of people. In front of 4 of his colleagues and his fiancée. "Lord," Pete said low and tired. "Walter, I didn't say anything." "I know you didn't," Pete said. "That's not always the right call, you know." "I know," I said. But I kept thinking about what Donna would have done. She would have smiled and waited and dealt with it later privately. Pete made a sound that was not quite agreement. "Donna was a more patient person than either of us," he said. "What are you going to do?" I looked out the windshield at the black wall of pines on either side of the highway, the headlights boring a tunnel through the dark. On the seat beside me was the unsigned birthday card I had brought for Mason. I had forgotten to give it to him at dinner, and he had not asked about it. Inside the card was a check for $500, because his birthday was the following week, and I had not known what else to bring. "I'm going to keep driving," I said. And think, sitting now at my December kitchen table, the false invoice in front of me and Natalie's headlights long gone down the gravel road, I understood something I had not fully understood in August. Mason had not called it that old cabin by accident. He had not been careless. He had been strategic. He needed his colleagues and his future father-in-law to see a version of his life in which his father was a retired man who puttered around a mountain cabin, not the man who had built the foundation under everything Mason was standing on. He needed me small so that he could appear large. And I had spent 40 years building things that held weight for a son who needed me to seem like I never had. There is a particular kind of wound that does not bleed. It does not announce itself. It simply opens quietly in a place you thought was already healed, and you do not realize how deep it goes until someone presses on it with intention. Mason had learned early where that place was, and he pressed on it every single time he needed something from me. September of 2023, 6 months into the wedding planning. 2 months after the rooftop dinner, 4 months before Natalie would sit across from me with that invoice. The aspens on the north slope of the property had gone gold the way they do every September without fail, and the mornings were cold enough now to see your breath. I had been splitting firewood since 6 in the morning when Mason's car came up the gravel road, a black Audi lease that I was fairly certain I had subsidized through one of the many transactions I had stopped tracking by name. He stepped out, looking polished in dark jeans and a cashmere sweater. His hair neat, carrying 2 cups of coffee from a place in Los Angeles that charged $9 a cup. He held one out to me with a wide smile. "Thought you could use this, Dad." I set down my splitting maul and took the cup. The coffee was lukewarm. He had driven 2 hours with it in a cup holder. "You made a long drive for a lukewarm coffee," I said. "I wanted to see you," Mason said, spreading his hands open the way he did when he wanted to appear uncalculated. "Can't a guy just come see his dad?" We sat on the porch. The lake was flat and gold with morning light, and the aspens on the far ridge were burning the kind of color that makes you ache a little, because you know it only lasts a week before the wind strips it clean. Mason talked for 20 minutes about the wedding the venue deposit had cleared. The catering contract was nearly finalized. Claire's dress had been ordered from a designer in New York. He spoke about it with the ownership of a man presenting his own achievement, never once acknowledging that the achievement was funded entirely by someone else's 4 decades of labor. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and laid it on the porch railing between us. It was a printed quote from an event design company: additional lighting installations, upgraded floral arrangements, custom monogram projections for the reception space. The total at the bottom read $14,200. "Claire has her heart set on it," Mason said. His voice had shifted softer now, lower the register he moved into when the performance was beginning. "It would make such a difference to the whole feel of the evening. I've covered what I can, but I'm stretched pretty thin right now. I know I've asked a lot already, Dad. I know that." "Then why are you asking again?" I said. I kept my voice level. I was watching the aspens. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he turned toward me and his expression rearranged itself into something genuinely painful looking. The face of a man reaching for a sorrow that was real enough to be borrowed, even if it was not his to use. "I was going through Mom's things last month," he said. "Some boxes Claire helped me unpack from storage. And I found this photograph you two at the lake maybe 99 or 2000 before the house was built. She had her head on your shoulder and she was laughing at something." He paused and his voice thickened in a way that tightened my chest before I could stop it. "She would have loved to see this wedding, Dad. She always talked about what it would be like when I found the right person. She would have wanted it to be beautiful." The aspen leaves moved on the far ridge. My jaw was tight. My hands wrapped around the lukewarm coffee cup had gone rigid. Donna had talked about Mason's wedding. That part was true. She had sat right here on this porch one autumn evening and said she hoped she would live to see the day. She had said it with her usual matter-of-fact honesty, not dramatizing it, not turning it into something heavy. Just saying it the way she said things, plainly and without performance. Mason knew she had said it. And he had taken that plain, private hope of hers and pressed it into service carefully and deliberately at precisely the moment when it would cost me the most to refuse. My eyes burned. My throat worked. I stared at the gold surface of the lake and breathed through it the way I had breathed through the hard things my whole life, steady in, steady out. Keep your hands on the work. "Your mother would have wanted a lot of things, Mason," I said. My voice was lower than I intended. "She would have wanted you to come up here without a quote sheet in your pocket." Mason blinked. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that was not grief and was not love. Then it was gone, replaced by the soft, wounded expression of a misunderstood son. "I just thought you'd want to know what she would have felt," he said quietly. I signed the check an hour later at the kitchen table. $14,200. Mason folded it into his jacket pocket, hugged me briefly at the car, the hug of a man who has gotten what he came for, and drove back down the mountain. I stood on the porch for a long time after his car disappeared. Pete called at noon, the way he often did when something felt off to him from half a mile away. "He came up," Pete said. Not a question. "He came up," I said. "Did he stay for dinner?" I looked at the empty porch chair where Mason had sat. The $9 coffee cup was still on the railing. He had not offered to take it with him. "He was gone by 10:30, I said. Pete exhaled a long, slow breath that carried everything he had decided not to say. "Walter," he said finally. "Donna loved that boy. But she loved you first. Don't forget that." I picked up the empty coffee cup. It was completely cold now and light in my hand, and I held it for a moment before walking inside to throw it away. I have signed my name on thousands of documents across 40 years of construction work. Purchase orders, subcontractor agreements, building permits, lien waivers, change orders, certificates of completion. I have signed in lawyers' offices and on tailgates of pickup trucks and on clipboards held by city inspectors standing in the rain. My signature is not elegant. It is fast and angular and leans slightly to the right with a particular way the W opens wide at the base and the G of Greer hooks back underneath itself. I know it the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood he has worked with his whole life. You do not need to think about it. You simply know. I was still sitting at the kitchen table when I picked up the Prestige event design invoice and looked at the signature line for the second time. The first look had told me what I needed to know. The second look confirmed it with the cold, clarifying precision of a level placed against a wall you already suspect is not plumb. The W was too careful. The letters were evenly spaced in a way mine never were, because I wrote fast and under pressure and never cared about evenness. The G hook at the end was too deliberate, too studied, the mark of someone who had practiced the motion rather than lived it. My son had signed my name to a $12,000 authorization without asking me, without telling me, without a single phone call or a text, or even the courtesy of a lie constructed in advance. I set the invoice down. I pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at the yellow grain of the wood and breathed in through my nose for 4 counts and out for 4 counts, the way I had taught myself to do on job sites when a situation was serious enough to require stillness before action. Around me, the house held its nighttime quiet, the refrigerator's low hum, the occasional tick of the floorboards settling in the cold, the distant sound of wind moving through the pines outside. Natalie was watching me from across the table. She had not moved since she slid the paper over. Her pen was completely still in her fingers, which told me everything about how serious she understood this to be. Natalie's pen was never still. "When did this order get placed?" I asked. My voice came out even. I was proud of that. "October 14th, Natalie said. The authorization form was submitted by email from Mason's business account. The physical copy with the signature was faxed the same day." She paused. "The vendor confirmed delivery of a deposit check drawn on an account I don't have access to. I don't know where the money came from, but the authorization to proceed with the order was signed in your name." "He didn't use my account," I said. "No," Natalie said. "Which means he either used his own funds for the deposit or borrowed from somewhere else. But the authorization, the legal permission to proceed, that is your signature, or something designed to look like it." I nodded slowly. In California, signing another person's name to a legal document without their authorization is a felony. I knew this not because I was a lawyer, but because I had spent 40 years working with contracts and had watched twice in my career what happened when subcontractors falsified authorization forms. It is not a gray area. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice made deliberately to to use someone else's identity to obtain something they would not have freely given. Mason had decided that asking me for $14,200 in September and receiving it was not enough. He had gone back to the same vendor in October, placed an additional order for $12,000 of upgraded services, signed my name to make it legitimate, and said nothing. I thought about the September visit, the lukewarm coffee, the aspen leaves, his voice thickening when he said her name. The check I signed at the kitchen table an hour after he arrived. He had driven 2 hours up the mountain, used Donna's memory to move me, gotten his check, and then 6 weeks later gone back and taken more without bothering to ask at all. "Natalie," I said. "Yes," she said. "I need you to pull every transaction associated with my name from the last 18 months. Every vendor, every authorization, every document that has my signature or claims to. I want to see all of it." Natalie did not hesitate. She reached into her canvas tote and produced a legal pad and her second pen. She always brought a second pen, and began writing a list in her precise, compact handwriting. Her jaw was set, and her movements were efficient and deliberate, and I understood that she had been waiting for this conversation for some time, and was relieved in the way that people who care about you are relieved when you finally arrive at the door they have been standing outside of. "I'll have a full report by Friday," she said. "Thursday," I said. She looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Thursday." She agreed. I stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the lake. It was fully dark now, the water invisible except for the pale reflection of the porch light lying on the surface like a path that went nowhere. Behind me, I heard Natalie packing her folders, the quiet zip of her tote, the soft scrape of her chair. "Walter," she said from the doorway. I turned. Her expression was careful and direct, the expression of a woman who had her uncle's face and her father's inability to leave hard things unsaid. "Whatever you decide to do," she said, "I'm going to help you do it right. Not fast. Right." I looked at her for a moment. Carl's daughter. Good bones, good sense, good judgment. The kind of person you build things with. "Thursday," I said again. After she left, I went to the drawer beside the kitchen sink, where I kept a small notepad and a pen for grocery lists. I wrote 3 words at the top of a clean page. Then I folded the page in half, set it on the table beside the invoice, and went to make myself another cup of coffee. The 3 words were "no more checks." Before I reveal what Natalie discovered when she uncovered the full truth behind Mason's actions, I want to ask you something. If you are still listening from Dad's Revenge Stories comment, stay below, so I know you are still here with me. And please remember, the story you are about to hear contains fictionalized elements and may not reflect real events. If this type of story is not for you, you are welcome to stop watching here. The 2 months between December and March moved the way time moves when you are waiting for something you cannot name. Not slowly exactly, more like carefully, the way you move through a room in the dark when you know the furniture has not changed, but you cannot quite trust your own memory of where things are. Natalie delivered her report on Thursday as promised. 14 pages, single-spaced, organized by date and vendor and dollar amount. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I reached page 6. The total was not surprising. What was surprising was the precision of it, the careful, methodical way the numbers had accumulated transaction by transaction, each one individually reasonable, collectively staggering. $412,000 over 30 months when you counted everything. The house, the credit line, the wedding commitments, the smaller requests, the invoice with the signature that was not mine. $412,000 drawn from a retirement I had built with my hands across 4 decades, redirected into the image of a life my son had never actually earned. I folded the report and put it in the drawer with the invoice. Then I went outside and split firewood for 3 hours until my shoulders ached and my mind was quiet. Through January and February, I said nothing to Mason. I answered his calls briefly and pleasantly. I responded to his texts with short, cordial replies. I did not tell him what Natalie had found. I did not tell him what I was thinking. I had spent 40 years on job sites where the most dangerous mistakes happened when someone acted before the situation was fully clear. I was waiting for the situation to become fully clear. It became fully clear on a Wednesday morning in early March. The 6th of March, 2024. 7 days before the wedding. I was at the kitchen island at 7 in the morning with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the early light come across the lake in long, flat bands, the color of old brass. The water was very still. A pair of herons were working the shallows near the dock, with the unhurried focus of creatures who understand exactly what they are there for. I had slept well, which surprised me. My body seemed to understand that something was ending. My phone buzzed once on the counter beside me. I looked at the screen. Mason's name. A text message. I set down my coffee cup. I picked up the phone. I read the message once straight through without stopping. It said, "Dad, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I need to be honest with you. Gerald is flying in from Houston specifically for this wedding, and he really needs to feel like the most important person in the room. Claire and I both feel like having you there might shift that dynamic in a way that would make things uncomfortable. You've done so much to make this happen, and we are so grateful. But we think it's best if you don't come to the wedding. Please leave the gate code with Natalie, and she can pass it along if we need anything before the venue transition. We love you." I read it a second time. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and looked at the herons on the lake. They had not moved. One of them stabbed its beak into the water with a sudden clean precision and came up with something silver and small. The other watched. Neither of them was troubled by anything. My coffee was still warm. I picked it up and drank the rest of it standing at the counter. I thought about $412,000. I thought about a stone path I had rebuilt in January, cold on my hands and knees, so that my hands would have something honest to do. I thought about a lukewarm $9 coffee left on a porch railing. I thought about a signature that was not mine on a document I had never seen. I thought about a boy who had once helped me carry lumber on weekends and asked me how I knew where to put the walls. Then I picked up my phone and called Pete. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert in the way of the men who have been awake since before sunrise their whole lives. "Walter, you're up early." "I got a text from Mason," I said. A pause. "What did it say?" I read it to him, word for word. All of it. When I finished, Pete was quiet for a full 10 seconds. I counted. Then he said, his voice very low and very even, "Walter, what are you going to do?" I walked to the kitchen window. The herons were still in the shallows. The light on the lake had warmed to something closer to gold. Behind me, the house was quiet and solid, every wall, plumb, every beam, bearing exactly the load it was designed to carry. I had built this place. I had built it for love, and I had built it right, and it had stood through 3 winters without a single thing going wrong with the structure. "Come, I'm going to reply to his message," I said, "and then I'm going to make some phone calls." "Do you need me?" Pete asked. "Not yet," I said, "but stay close." I hung up. I opened Mason's message. I typed 5 words. My thumbs did not hesitate, did not pause, did not tremble even slightly over the letters. I had known what needed to be said for a long time. The message had simply made it official. The 5 words were, "Then get off my property." I sent it. I set the phone down again, face up this time. Then I walked to my desk in the study, opened the top drawer, and took out the folder that contained every vendor contract for the wedding, the catering company, the venue, the limousine service, the event design firm. I carried the folder to the kitchen table and set it in the center, squarely the way you set a tool down when you are about to use it. The herons were still working the shallows. The morning was still beautiful. Some things do not change because a message arrives. I opened the folder and reached for the phone. I have walked off 3 job sites in 40 years. Not often, because walking off a job site is a serious thing. It means contracts. It means money. It means relationships built over years that may not survive the decision. But there are moments in construction when you arrive at a site and the work that has been done is so fundamentally wrong, so structurally dishonest, that continuing would make you complicit in something you cannot put your name on. In those moments you stop, you document, you make your calls, and you walk. I sat down at the kitchen table with the vendor folder open in front of me and Pete's number dialed on my phone. He picked up before the first ring finished. "Tell me what you need," he said. No preamble, no questions. 35 years of friendship had taught him when I was in the middle of something that required action rather than conversation. "I need you to sit on the line," I said. "I have 4 calls to make. I want a witness." "Done," Pete said. I heard the creak of his chair as he settled in. "Go ahead, Walter." I put him on speaker and laid the phone on the table beside the folder. Then I opened to the first contract, smoothed the pages flat with my palm, and picked up my reading glasses. The first call was to Grandview Estate, the wedding venue in San Gabriel Valley. $48,000. The contract was 11 pages long, and I had read every word of it the day I signed it, because I read every contract I sign. Page 4 contained the cancellation provisions. Because my name was listed as the primary contract holder and financial guarantor on the agreement, I had the contractual authority to request cancellation. The venue's cancellation policy allowed me to cancel within the stated window, subject to the administrative fee outlined in the contract. The wedding was 7 days away. I was well within the window. A woman named Sandra answered. She had a professional voice, warm and practiced. "Grandview Estate, this is Sandra. How can I help you?" "Sandra, my name is Walter Greer," I said. "I am the primary contract holder for the Hayes Greer wedding event scheduled for March 16th. I need to initiate a cancellation of that contract effective immediately." A pause. "Mr. Greer, are you certain the event is 1 week away? We have significant resources already allocated." "I understand that," I said. "I have read the cancellation provisions on page 4 of our agreement. I am within the cancellation window. I would like to proceed." Another pause, longer this time. "May I ask the reason for the cancellation?" "The reason," I said, "is that I am no longer willing to fund an event I am not permitted to attend. Please send the cancellation confirmation to the email on file." Silence on the line. Then, "Of course, Mr. Greer. I'll process that immediately. I'm very sorry." "Thank you, Sandra," I said. "You've been professional throughout. This is not a reflection of your work." I ended the call. From the phone speaker, Pete let out a breath that was not quite a whistle. 48,000, he said quietly. "Lord." "Second call," I said. The catering company was Harvest & Cohen, a full-service event caterer out of Pasadena. $22,000. The account manager who answered was a man named Douglas, who became very still on the line when I explained the situation. As primary contract holder, I had the authority to halt service preparation and cancel all delivery commitments. Douglas confirmed the cancellation in under 4 minutes and sent the written confirmation while we were still on the phone. I thanked him. He said he hoped things worked out. I told him they already were. Third, Pete said from the speaker, and I could hear in his voice that he had stopped being surprised and started being something closer to quietly, fiercely proud. The limousine company was straightforward. $9,500, a fleet of 4 vehicles contracted for pickup and delivery on the wedding day. The dispatcher I reached had handled cancellations before and moved through the process with efficient sympathy. The vehicles were released from hold within 6 minutes. I thanked her and moved on. The fourth call was to Prestige Event Design. I looked at their contract for a moment before I dialed. Prestige Event Design, the same company whose invoice carried a signature that was not mine. $16,000 for the primary decoration package I had legitimately authorized, in addition to the $12,000 Mason had ordered without asking. When their account manager answered, I identified myself, referenced both orders by contract number, and requested immediate cancellation of all services and removal of any materials already installed at the venue. The account manager hesitated. Mr. Greer, we do have 2 orders under your name, the primary contract and a supplementary order from October. See, I am aware of both, I said. I am authorizing cancellation of the primary contract. Regarding the supplementary order, I did not authorize that order, and my signature on the authorization form was not placed by me. I am formally disputing that transaction and requesting its removal from my account. You will receive written documentation of this dispute by end of business Friday. A very long pause. I understand, Mr. Greer. I'll flag both orders for review. Good, thank you, I said. I ended the call. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light had moved across the lake, and the shadows of the pines were lengthening toward the water. 4 calls. 2 hours and 17 minutes from the first to the last. $95,500 in contracted services canceled and dissolved by the man whose name was on every single page. Pete's voice came through the speaker, low and deliberate. Walter, are you all right? I looked at the folder on the table. All 4 contracts, their pages turned to the cancellation confirmations now loading in my email one by one. I thought about 40 years of honest work. I thought about the note in my kitchen drawer that said 3 words. I am better than all right, I said. I am clear. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the simplicity of a man who has known you long enough to mean it without ceremony. Good. Come for dinner. Doris made chili. I closed the folder. I stood up from the table. My back was stiff from sitting and my hands were steady and my mind was the quietest it had been in 3 years. Outside, the pines stood the way they always stood, straight, deep-rooted, indifferent to weather. I'll be there at 6, I said. I drove home from Pete's house at 9:30 that Wednesday night, with the windows down, despite the cold, because the mountain air at that hour smells like nothing else on earth, and I wanted to be fully inside it. Doris's chili had been exactly what it needed, to be thick and smoky, and eaten at a kitchen table with people who did not require anything from me, except my presence. Pete had talked about a fence he was planning to rebuild along his eastern property line. Doris had told a long story about her sister's visit that had no particular point, but was funny in the way that stories told by people who love each other are always funny, because the point is never the story. It was the best evening I had spent in months. I slept without difficulty for the first time since December. Thursday morning arrived, gray and soft clouds sitting low over the ridge. The lake the color of old pewter. I woke at 5:30 out of habit, and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the house. It was quiet in the particular way of a well-built structure, not empty quiet, but settled quiet, the quiet of walls that know what they are doing. Donna had called it the house's breathing. She said every good house breathes differently, and that ours breathed slowly, like someone who has learned that there is no reason to rush. I got up and made coffee and drank it, standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come up, and then I did something I had been meaning to do for weeks. I went upstairs to the bedroom and began to put it in order. Not because it was disordered. I kept the house clean out of the same discipline that had kept my job sites clean for 40 years. But there were corners of that room I had left untouched since Donna passed, drawers I had not opened, because opening them meant handling things that still held her shape in some way I could not fully explain. The cream-colored cardigan folded on the chair by the window. The stack of library books on her nightstand, 3 of them, with bookmarks still inside, waiting for a reader who would not return. I had left those things because removing them felt like a kind of erasure, and I was not ready for that. That Thursday morning I was ready. I worked slowly and carefully the way I worked on fine finished carpentry, without hurry, with full attention to each thing in my hands. I folded the cardigan and laid it in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I returned the library books, bookmark, and all to the shelf in the hallway. I opened the drawer of her nightstand and went through it, item by item: hand lotion, a pair of reading glasses with one bent temple, a notepad with a grocery list in her handwriting, that I sat with for a long moment before placing it carefully in the cedar chest beside the cardigan. At the very back of the drawer, my fingers found a small envelope. It was ivory-colored, the size of a greeting card, sealed with the kind of deliberate care that means the person who sealed it was thinking about who would open it. On the front, in Donna's handwriting, smaller and more careful than her usual hand, the handwriting of someone who was choosing each word for Walter. When you need it most. My hands were not steady when I opened it. I want to be honest about that. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and my hands were shaking the way they shook after the table saw accident in '89, that particular fine tremor that has nothing to do with cold, and everything to do with knowing that what you are holding matters in a way you cannot prepare for. The letter was 2 pages written front and back on the same ivory notepaper. Her handwriting was smaller than usual, but perfectly legible. Donna had always been precise, even at the end, perhaps, especially at the end. She had written it in October of 2021, 6 weeks before she passed. She said she had been thinking about what came after, not for herself, but for me, because she knew me well enough to know that I would pour everything I had into whoever needed it most, and she knew who that would be. She said she was not writing to tell me not to love Mason. She said she understood why I would, and she would have done the same. But she wanted me to hear her voice on the day I needed it most, so she was writing it down while she still could. She wrote, "Walt, you have spent your whole life building things for other people. You built our home last because that is who you are. Don't let that be the pattern forever. The lake is yours. The dock is yours. The roses I planted along the south fence are going to come back every June, whether anyone tends them or not, because good things have a way of persisting. You persisted. That is the most important thing you ever built. Don't let your love become a burden on yourself. You are allowed to keep something just for you." She had signed it the way she signed birthday cards and grocery lists and the inside cover of books she gave as gifts, not with her full name, just "Your Donna." I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The clouds outside had begun to break apart along the ridge, and thin lines of light were coming through the gaps and lying across the floor in long, warm strips. Downstairs, the coffee maker finished its second cycle with a small sound, like a sigh. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed smelled faintly of the wood, and faintly of her, the way things do when they have been close to someone for a long time. I was not quiet about it. I want to be honest about that too. I sat on that bed, and I put my face in my hands, and I cried the way I had not cried since the night she passed. Not the controlled, functional grief of a man managing his loss in public, but the full, ungoverned kind that comes up from somewhere below the chest and takes the breath with it. My shoulders shook. The letter was still in my hands. When it passed, I sat up straight and pressed the back of my wrist against my eyes and breathed until I was steady. Then I read the letter one more time, slowly, every word. I folded it with great care and tucked it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, close to where it needed to be. Then I stood up, straightened the bedspread with both hands, and walked downstairs to face whatever came next. The roses along the south fence were still months from blooming, but they were there under the cold ground, waiting. Just like she said. I learned what happened that day through Natalie first, and later through Gerald Whitfield himself. Their accounts matched in every important detail, and after everything I had uncovered, I knew I needed to understand exactly what happened inside that room. I listened carefully, compared every piece of information, and trusted the facts that could be confirmed. Friday morning, the 8th of March. The day Mason had scheduled the final walkthrough at Grandview Estate. I spent that morning splitting wood. Not because I needed to. I had enough firewood stacked along the north wall of the shed to carry me through 2 winters, but because it was what my hands wanted to do, and I had learned long ago to trust that. The maul rose and fell in the cold air, the rounds split clean along the grain, and I thought about nothing in particular except the work in front of me. Donna's letter was still in my shirt pocket. I had put it there again that morning without thinking about it the way you put something in your pocket that you want to keep close. At 11:17, Natalie called. I set the maul down against the woodpile and answered. "Walter," she said. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was managing information carefully, not concealing it, but measuring how to deliver it so that it landed with precision rather than force. "I just heard from Renee. She works the front desk at Grandview." "Tell me," I said. I sat down on the splitting round and waited. Mason had arrived at Grandview Estate at 10:45 that morning in the black Audi with Claire in the passenger seat, and Gerald Whitfield following behind in his rental car. According to Renee, Mason walked through the main entrance with the confidence of a man who owned the place shoulders back. One hand at the small of Claire's back, already talking before he reached the reception desk, already performing for the audience of one gray-haired man in the good jacket walking quietly behind them. The events coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who had managed the Grandview bookings for 11 years, met them at the entrance to the main hall. She was professional and direct, which under the circumstances was the kindest thing she could have been. She informed Mason that the contract for the event scheduled March 16th had been canceled by the primary contract holder on March 6th. All deposits and service commitments had been formally dissolved per the cancellation provisions of the original agreement. The venue was no longer reserved. There were no services pending. There was nothing here for them. Mason's face, according to Renee, went through several expressions. Very quickly, confusion first. Then a flash of something hot and panicked. Then a forced steadiness that did not quite hold around the edges. He told Patricia there had been a mistake. Patricia told him there had not. He asked to speak to the manager. Patricia told him she was the manager. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Natalie believed it was to me, though I did not receive it because my phone was inside the house, and I was splitting wood and stood in the entrance of the Grandview main hall holding a phone that rang through to voicemail, while Claire gripped her own phone with both hands, and Gerald Whitfield stood 4 feet behind them and said nothing at all. Gerald said nothing for a very long time. Then he asked in the quiet, deliberate voice of a man who has built a successful business by asking the right question at the right moment. Mason. Who paid for this venue? Natalie said that Renee said the entrance hall went very still after that question. Patricia had stepped back toward her desk. Claire had turned toward Mason. Mason had lowered his phone from his ear. Mason, Gerald said again, not louder, just with more weight behind it. Who has been paying for all of this? And Mason, according to everyone whose account I have been able to piece together, did not answer. His mouth opened and his chest expanded as though he were about to speak, and then it all seemed to deflate at once. The shoulders, the careful posture, the performance he had been constructing and maintaining for 2 years. He looked, Natalie told me, like a building whose load-bearing wall has just been quietly removed. Everything above it still in place for one long, impossible moment, and then beginning to lean. Gerald looked at him for a measured time. Then he turned, walked back through the entrance doors, and got into his rental car. He did not say another word to Mason. He did not say another word to Claire. Renee watched his car pull out of the Grandview parking lot from the front desk window, and said it moved with the particular steadiness of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. Claire began to cry in the entrance hall. Mason stood where he was. Natalie finished telling me all of this in a careful, measured voice. When she was done, the line between us held a quiet that was not uncomfortable, just full the way silence gets when 2 people are both thinking about the same thing. He didn't answer Gerald's question. I said finally, it was not a question. No, Natalie said. He didn't. I looked out across the lake from the woodpile. The clouds had moved off the ridge by mid-morning, and the water was bright now, almost too bright to look at directly. A pair of osprey were circling high and slow above the far shore, riding a thermal with their wings barely moving the way things ride, when they understand how to use what is already there. Are you all right? Natalie asked. I thought about Gerald's question, hanging in the entrance hall of a venue that was no longer booked. I thought about the answer Mason could not give. I thought about what it must have felt like to stand in that beautiful space with the truth finally visible to everyone in the room, with nowhere left to put it. I said. Thank you for telling me, Natalie. After I hung up, I stood at the woodpile for a moment, with my hand resting on the handle of the splitting maul. The wood was solid and cold under my palm. Then Pete's truck came up the gravel road and pulled to a stop, and he stepped out with 2 cups of coffee and 1 look at my face. You heard, he said. I heard, I said. He handed me a cup. It was hot. Gerald left without saying a word to him, Pete said. He had his own sources. He always did. I know, I said. We stood there together in the cold morning air and drank our coffee and looked at the lake, and neither of us said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. Some things speak clearly enough on their own. Claire Whitfield posted the video on Saturday morning at 8:47. Natalie sent me the link at 9:03 with a single line of text beneath it. You need to see this before it gets bigger. I was on the dock with my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. I read Natalie's message, set my cup down on the dock planks, and pressed play. The video was 3 minutes and 22 seconds long. Claire had filmed it in what appeared to be a hotel room, soft lighting, a carefully chosen angle, her hair down in the way she wore it when she wanted to appear vulnerable rather than polished. Mason sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes doing the thing they did when he was performing an emotion, rather than feeling it slightly too steady, slightly too held. Claire spoke most of it. Her voice broke in the right places. She described a family member. She did not say my name, but the implication was clear enough, who had promised to support their wedding, and then out of what she called jealousy and control had deliberately destroyed everything 1 week before the ceremony. She used the word sabotage 4 times. She used the word heartbroken 7. At the end, Mason looked into the camera and said quietly and with great practiced weight, "We just wanted our day. That's all we ever wanted." The video had 42,000 views by the time I finished watching it. I put my phone in my shirt pocket, picked up my coffee, and sat looking at the lake for a while. The water was doing what it always does on a clear March morning, catching the light and breaking it into pieces, bright and cold and completely indifferent to anything happening on shore. I thought about 42,000 people watching my son perform grief about a wedding I had funded entirely with my own money on a platform that does not ask for receipts. Then I went inside and called Natalie. She answered immediately. "I've been waiting," she said. "I need you to help me put something together," I said. Not a response, not an explanation, just the documents, scanned clean in order. The venue contract with my name as primary holder, the catering agreement, the limousine booking, the decor contract, and a screenshot of Mason's text message from March 6th. "I have all of it," Natalie said. I could hear her already moving, the sound of folders and the soft click of her scanner warming up. "How do you want to present it?" "1 post," I said. "No caption except 2 words. Just the documents." A brief pause. "What 2 words?" "The facts," I said. Natalie was quiet for exactly the length of time it takes a precise person to decide that a precise plan is correct. "I'll have it ready in an hour," she said. I did not have a large social media presence. I had created an account 2 years earlier, at Pete's insistence, largely to look at photographs of fishing conditions on the lake during different seasons, and occasionally to see what Natalie posted about her hikes. I had 41 followers. Most of them were people I knew personally. By Sunday evening, I had 11,000. The post went up at 11:15 Saturday morning. 4 scanned documents, the venue contract showing Walter R. Greer as sole financial guarantor, the catering agreement in my name, the limousine booking confirmation, the decor contract, and a screenshot of Mason's text message from March 6th. The one that said Gerald needed the spotlight, and that my presence would make things uncomfortable, and that they loved me. No additional text, no emotional language, no accusations, just the facts. Natalie called me at noon. "It's moving," she said. Her voice was careful and level. "People are sharing it. Comments are coming in fast." "Are they reading it?" I asked. "They're reading it," she said. "Walter Gerald Whitfield commented 40 minutes ago." I had not expected that. "What did he say?" Natalie read it to me. Gerald had written 7 words. "This man deserved better. I am sorry." He had not tagged Mason. He had not tagged Claire. He had simply said what he thought plainly and without performance, the way I had come to understand was his nature. Pete called at 2 in the afternoon, barely able to contain himself. "Walter, do you know what Claire's comment section looks like right now?" "I don't need to know," I said. "I'm going to tell you anyway," Pete said. "It looks like justice." That's what it looks like. He paused. Her followers are not happy with her. Several of them used words I won't repeat in mixed company. Pete, I said. All right, all right. I could hear him grinning through the phone. But I want you to know that 42,000 people watched that video of theirs, and at least 30,000 of them have now seen your post and understand exactly what happened. Mason sent you a text banning you from a wedding you paid for. That is now public record. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the property. The wood I had split over the past 2 days was stacked along the north shed wall in clean, even rows. The dock stretched out over the water, solid and straight, the Douglas fir planks weathered to a good silver gray. The roses along the south fence were still underground, but I knew they were there. "How is the comment section on my post?" I asked. "Remarkably civil," Natalie said from the other call I had merged without thinking. "People are angry on your behalf, but mostly they are just clear. They see what happened. You gave them the information and they drew their own conclusions. That was what I had intended. I had not wanted sympathy. I had not wanted to perform anything. I had simply wanted the people who had watched Claire's video to have access to the same material I had access to, the contracts, the receipts the words Mason had actually written on an actual morning when he thought he had already won. Gerald's 7 words sat in the comment section of my post all afternoon. I read them several times. This man deserved better. I am sorry. I thought about the dinner at Maison Laurent, how Gerald had asked me about the property and listened with the attention of a man who respected what real work looked like. I thought about how Mason had cut across that conversation to redirect Gerald's attention back to himself. I thought about 2 old men who might have talked honestly over a Thanksgiving table if a plumbing emergency that was not an emergency had not sent one of them down the mountain. I typed a reply to Gerald's comment. 4 words. "Thank you, Gerald." Likewise. Then I put my phone down and went to make dinner. The lake was quiet outside the kitchen window. Somewhere across the water, an owl called once and went silent. The evening settled around the property the way evenings do when a long day has finally said everything it needed to say. The weekend passed quietly. Saturday's post continued to move through the internet in the way that true things move, not explosively, but steadily finding its audience, the way water finds level ground. By Sunday evening, several of Mason and Claire's mutual friends had reached out to Natalie privately to say they had not known, that they were sorry, that they wished things were different. Natalie passed these messages along to me with her usual precision. I read them once and set my phone down and went to bed at 9 o'clock, which is when I have always gone to bed, and which nothing in the preceding week had given me any reason to change. Monday morning, Natalie called at 8:15 with a different kind of news. "A man named Troy Bassett contacted me yesterday evening," she said. "He works or worked in commercial real estate. He said he had information about Mason that he thought you should have. He was clear that he did not want his name made public. He said his reasons were personal." I poured my second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. "What kind of information, Haji Hazani?" "He sent me screenshots," Natalie said. "Walter Mason has been using photographs of your property on his professional real estate profile for at least 2 years. I set the coffee cup down. "To 14 photographs." Natalie continued, her voice measured and careful. "Taken from various angles of the lake house and the dock and the south grounds. He has them listed in a portfolio section of his business website, under a heading that reads, and I am quoting directly, 'Properties under management and development.' Several of them include the dock you built. 3 of them show the rose beds along the south fence. One is an aerial shot taken in autumn when the aspens were gold. I did not speak for a moment. Outside, the morning was bright and cold, the lake absolutely still. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the pines along the north slope, a rapid, purposeful sound, the sound of something that knows exactly what it is looking for and intends to find it. He told clients those properties were his. I asked. He implied it, Natalie said. The framing of the portfolio suggests these are properties in his professional portfolio assets he manages or has developed. There is no attribution to you, no mention of ownership. A prospective client looking at that page would reasonably conclude that Mason Greer had significant real estate holdings, including a substantial lakeside property. I thought about the rooftop dinner in August. The Stanford MBA man leaning forward with genuine interest, asking about the property, and Mason sliding in between us to redirect the conversation. Putter around! That old cabin. And then behind my back, and without a single word to me, taking 14 photographs of that same cabin and presenting them to professional contacts as evidence of his own success. He had called it small to my face. He had used it to make himself large behind my back. I picked up the coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the woodpecker hole forming in the pine beyond the window. There are moments when the full shape of something becomes visible all at once. Not a new piece of information, but the existing pieces finally arranging themselves into a picture you can see clearly. This was one of those moments. The fundraising for the wedding, the fake signature, the Thanksgiving plumbing call, the rooftop dinner. And underneath all of it, for 2 years, 14 photographs of a place he called an old cabin, doing the work he could not do himself. Troy Bassett, I said. Why is he helping? He said Mason had him passed over for a promotion 2 years ago by misrepresenting Troy's performance figures to senior management, Natalie said. He has documentation of that as well, though he said that is his own matter to handle separately. He contacted me because he saw your post and felt it was the right time. Is he a credible source? I verified 3 of the screenshots independently, Natalie said. The photographs on Mason's website match your property. I compared them against the listing photos from when you permitted the build in 2019. The dock, the rose beds, the aerial, they are your property. No question. I nodded slowly, though there was no one to see it. What do I need to do? I've already drafted a formal complaint to the California Department of Real Estate, Natalie said. The DRE regulates licensed real estate professionals in California and prohibits the use of misleading representations in marketing materials. Using photographs of property you do not own or manage presented in a context that implies ownership or management authority is a violation of their conduct standards. I can file on your behalf with your authorization, and I've also drafted a cease and desist notice to the hosting platform for Mason's website. Send it, I said. Both, I said. Today. There was a brief pause. Then Natalie said with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had the documents already prepared and was simply waiting for the word done. I took my coffee out to the dock after the call. The air was sharp and clean, and the water below the dock planks was very clear. I could see the bottom stones 8 feet down resting in the cold, and the quiet undisturbed by anything happening at the surface. I sat on the dock bench and looked at the property from the water's edge. The dock I had built from reclaimed Douglas fir. The south fence with Donna's rose beds lying dormant underneath the cold ground. The house itself set back from the shore, every window plumb the stone chimney rising straight against the pale blue sky. 14 photographs of this place presented to strangers as evidence of another man's success. Pete came down the path from the road at 10 o'clock, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He sat down beside me on the dock bench without saying anything for a moment, looking at the water. "Natalie called me," he said finally. "I know she did," I said. Pete looked out at the lake. A long moment passed. Then he turned to me with an expression that was caught somewhere between outrage and something that was almost painfully funny. "Walter," he said. "He called it an old cabin to your face." He shook his head slowly. "And then he put 14 pictures of it on his website to make himself look rich." I looked at the dock planks under my feet. The Douglas fir had gone silver gray over 3 winters the way good wood does when it weathers honestly. "Yes," I said. "He did." Pete shook his head again. The outrage had settled into something quieter and sadder. "What kind of man does that?" he said, not really asking, just saying it the way you say things that do not have a satisfying answer. I thought about the boy who had once sat on my tailgate eating Donna's sandwiches and asked me how I knew where to put the walls. I thought about what I had told him. "You read the land," I had said. "You look at what is actually there, not what you wish was there. And then you build accordingly." "A man who never learned to build anything himself," I said. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one solid, wordless pressure, and we sat together on the dock I had built and looked at the lake that was mine, and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. I have been telling this story the way I lived, it not always in the order the calendar would prefer, but in the order that makes sense to a man sorting through the wreckage of something he built with his hands and his heart. The wedding came and went on the 16th of March. What Gerald Whitfield said to me came after. But I want to tell you about Gerald first, because what he said matters more than what the photographs showed. Gerald Whitfield called on a Tuesday morning in the last week of March and asked if he could come up. He did not explain why. He simply said he had some things he wanted to say in person, that he was still in California finishing up some business, and that he would understand completely if I preferred not to have the company. His voice was straightforward and without ceremony, the voice of a man who was accustomed to asking for what he needed without dressing it up. I told him he was welcome. He said he would arrive around 10. He drove up in a rented pickup truck. Not the Mercedes sedan I had expected based on the man I thought I knew from 2 dinners and a parking lot. A dark blue Ford, sensibly sized with a rental sticker on the rear bumper and a paper coffee cup in the cup holder visible through the window when he stepped out. He was wearing work boots and a canvas jacket, and he shook my hand the same way he had at Maison Laurent, firmly, fully, without performance. "Good land," he said, looking out across the property before we had exchanged another word. He turned slowly, taking in the house, the tree line, the slope down to the water. "How many acres did you say?" 7, I said. He nodded slowly the way men nod when a number confirms something they were already calculating. "And you built the house yourself?" "Every nail," I said. He looked at the house for another moment. Then he turned back to me. "Can we sit somewhere?" I took him down to the dock. I made coffee, first a full pot, the good kind I kept for company, and carried 2 mugs down the gravel path to the water. Gerald walked beside me without speaking, his boots quiet on the path, his eyes moving across the property with the attentive measuring look of a man who had spent his life assessing the real value of things. We sat on the dock bench with the lake in front of us and the property rising behind us, and the late March morning, doing what California late March mornings do, cool and luminous, the light coming in low and sideways across the water, turning everything it touched to something worth looking at. Gerald wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked at the lake for a long time before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. His voice was level and direct without the softness people sometimes use to make an apology easier to deliver. "I brought my daughter into a situation I had not examined carefully enough. I took Mason at his word because Claire loved him and because the picture he presented was convincing. I am a man who prides himself on reading people." He paused. "I misread him. Badly." "You weren't the only one," I said. "No," Gerald said. "But I had less reason to trust him than you did, and more reason to look carefully. He wasn't my son." He turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands. "He showed me photographs of this property when we first met. Said it was a family holding. Said he managed the estate on your behalf." He stopped. I believed him. I looked out at the water. A merganser was working the far shore, diving and surfacing with the unhurried efficiency of a creature that understands its own competence. "He told you he managed it," I said. "He implied significant involvement," Gerald said carefully. I did not ask follow-up questions I should have asked. He exhaled not quite a sigh, more the breath of a man releasing something he has been carrying for a while. "My father ran a diner in Beaumont, Texas for 31 years. 6 stools at the counter, 8 tables open at 5 in the morning. He built the back addition himself with 2 of his brothers over one summer. I grew up understanding what real work looks like." He looked at me directly. "When I walked around this property this morning, I understood immediately what kind of man built it. And I understood that I should have asked better questions a long time ago." "Gerald," I said, "Mason is skilled at presenting what people want to see. That is not a small talent. It is simply not a foundation you can build a life on." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you?" he asked. "To see through it clearly." I thought about that honestly. "Longer than it should have," I said. "Because he was my son. And I wanted to believe the version of him I knew when he was 12 years old was still in there somewhere. It may still be, but I cannot build on what might be there. I can only build on what is." Gerald nodded. He looked back at the lake. The merganser had moved on, and the surface where it had been was smooth again, as though it had never been disturbed. "Claire filed for divorce last week," he said, not with satisfaction, just as information delivered plainly. "I heard," I said. "I am sorry for that. Whatever Mason did, that is still your daughter's pain." Gerald looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of a man who has just been surprised by another man's decency at a moment when decency was not required. "Thank you," he said. "She will be all right. She is tougher than she appears." A brief pause. "She gets that from her mother." We sat for a while after that without talking, which felt entirely natural. 2 men in their 60s who had each spent their lives building things, one with his hands, one with his name, on a lease sitting on a dock in the late March morning, and looking at water that had been here before either of them and would be here after. Eventually, Gerald set his empty coffee mug on the bench beside him and looked at the house. "Your wife picked this land," he said. It was not a question. He had read it somehow from the property itself, the way the house faced the water, the rose beds along the south fence, the particular care of a place that had been built for love rather than investment. "From the car window," I said. She grabbed my arm and said, "That's it. Gerald smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him, small and unguarded, the smile of a man thinking about someone he understood. My wife picked our first restaurant location the same way, he said. Drove past an empty storefront in Houston, grabbed my arm, nearly caused an accident. He shook his head. 31 years later, it's still our best performing location. He stood when it was time to go, and we shook hands at the end of the gravel path where his truck was parked. He held the handshake a beat longer than he needed to, which was the most he allowed himself in the way of what he wanted to say. "Your wife must have been a remarkable woman," he said, "to be loved the way this place shows she was." My throat tightened. I held his eyes and nodded once because it was all I trusted myself to do in that moment. He got into the truck and drove down the road. I stood at the end of the path and watched until the sound of his engine faded into the pines. Then I walked back down to the dock and sat with my cold coffee and the lake and the late morning light. It had gone cold while we talked. I did not mind at all. The 16th of March arrived the way days arrive when you have been dreading them and then stopped dreading them quietly without announcement. Just another Saturday morning with the lake doing what the lake does and the pines standing in the way they always stand. I did not go to the wedding. I had been formally uninvited, and beyond that there was no wedding to go to, in the way Mason had imagined it. I spent the morning doing what I had spent most mornings doing since December, working with my hands, staying close to the property, letting the physical world keep me honest. I rehung the gate on the north side of the property that had been sticking since autumn. I cleared the drainage channel along the eastern fence line. I ate lunch on the porch and watched a pair of red-tailed hawks trade thermals above the ridge. Natalie sent me 3 photographs at 2:15 in the afternoon. She included a single line of text from a colleague who attended. "Thought you should see, but only if you want to." I looked at the photographs. The venue was a mid-range event space in the San Fernando Valley, the kind of place that rents by the hour for corporate luncheons and retirement parties, with round tables that seat 8 and a small raised platform at one end that functions as the stage. The tablecloths were white and slightly too large for the tables pooling on the floor at the corners. The centerpieces were grocery store flowers, carnations, and baby's breath arranged in clear glass vases, the kind of flowers that are not wrong, exactly just honest about what the budget was. The room held perhaps 40 guests seated with the particular self-consciousness of people at an event that has not gone the way anyone expected. The second photograph was of Mason and Claire at the platform. Mason was in a dark suit that fit him well. He had always known how to dress, but his shoulders carried something his suit could not hide. There is a posture I have seen on jobs when a foreman realizes midway through a project that the plans were wrong from the beginning, and the corrections will be visible in the finished work no matter what he does. Mason had that posture. Claire stood beside him in a dress that must have cost a significant amount of money, and looked at the camera with the composed, controlled expression of a woman managing something she had not anticipated managing on this particular day. Gerald was not in either photograph. Natalie's colleague told her he had sat through the ceremony and left immediately after, without attending the reception. He had not spoken at the event. He had shaken Mason's hand once briefly and driven back to his hotel. The third photograph was of the food table. A buffet set up along the side wall, catered sandwich platters, pasta salad in a foil tray, a tiered wedding cake that was smaller than it should have been, and listing slightly to the left. I looked at the 3 photographs for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the porch railing and sat very still for a while, watching the hawks above the ridge. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel satisfied. I did not feel vindicated. What I felt was a slow, heavy sadness of the specific kind that comes when something you hoped might still be salvageable finally, and visibly, is not. I had not wanted Mason's wedding to be that. I had wanted some stubborn, irrational part of me had wanted for Mason to have found some way to build something real, even at the last moment. He had not. And the 3 photographs made that undeniable. Pete called at 4 o'clock. "I heard from Doris's nephew," he said. "He was there." "I know," I said. "Natalie sent photographs." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Walter, are you all right?" "I am sad," I said. "Not for the wedding. For the person he could have been if he had spent the last 20 years building something instead of performing something." Pete did not fill that silence with reassurance, which was exactly right. He let it sit for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Yeah." Just that. Just the word with the weight of a man who had known Mason since he was a boy and understood exactly what was being mourned. The weeks that followed moved with the particular speed of consequences that have been a long time building. In April, Mason's company completed an internal review that had been quietly initiated after the public scandal. The combination of Mason's social media exposure and the DRE complaint Natalie had filed created enough institutional concern that the firm's compliance department opened a formal inquiry. Investigators found that Mason had used the company's professional credibility to approach private investors for a side venture without proper disclosure or authorization, a violation of California securities regulations that required a broker-dealer license he did not possess. His management position was suspended pending the outcome of the review. His access to company accounts and client files was revoked. In May, Claire's attorney filed the divorce petition in Los Angeles Superior Court. The grounds cited were irreconcilable differences and material misrepresentation of financial status, meaning that Claire's legal team intended to argue Mason had misled her about the nature and extent of his assets before the marriage. California is a community property state, which meant that the division of marital assets would be governed by what Mason actually had, rather than what he had appeared to have. The answer to that question, Natalie told me quietly, was not going to take long to establish. I read Natalie's summary of the divorce filing on a Tuesday evening in May, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Outside, the late spring light was lying long and gold across the lake, and the roses along the south fence had begun to push their first leaves up through the dark soil right on schedule, just as Donna had promised they would. I folded Natalie's summary and set it on the table. I sat with both hands wrapped around the tea mug and looked at the roses through the window for a long time. He had had every advantage. Every door I could open, I had opened. Every foundation I could lay, I had laid. A man cannot do more for his son than that. What the son builds on that foundation is the son's own work. Mason had built a performance. And performances, no matter how convincing, do not hold weight. I finished my tea. I rinsed the mug. I went to bed. The last Tuesday of May arrived warm and still. The kind of evening that comes to Big Bear Lake in the last week of spring, when the altitude and the season find an agreement with each other, and the result is something close to perfect. The light on the water was the color of heated copper, and the roses along the south fence had been blooming for 3 weeks by then. Deep red, exactly as Donna had planned them, their fragrance moving up the slope in the warm air when the breeze came off the lake. I was on the porch with a book I had not been reading, mostly just sitting with the evening when I heard the car on the gravel road. I knew the sound of it before I saw it. The particular engine note of the black Audi, the speed of it coming up the road, faster than a neighbor, faster than a delivery, the speed of someone who has run out of other directions to go. I set the book down on the porch railing and sat still and waited. The car stopped at the gate at the bottom of the driveway. The gate was closed and latched the way I had taken to keeping it since March. I heard the engine idle for a moment. Then it shut off. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel. Then Mason's voice coming up the slope toward the house. "Dad." Not a shout more, the voice of a man testing whether sound will carry, whether the distance between them can be crossed by something as simple as a word. "Dad, it's me." I sat on the porch and did not move. "Dad, please." His voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Not the smooth, practiced tone of the rooftop dinner. Not the softened, calculated register he used when he needed something. Not even the performed grief of the social media video. This was something rawer and less managed, the voice of a person who has exhausted the performance and arrived perhaps for the first time in a long time at something underneath it. "I know you can see me on the camera. I know you're up there. Please." I stood up from the porch chair. I walked to the side of the house where the upstairs window looks down the slope toward the gate. I opened the window and looked down. Mason stood at the gate with both hands wrapped around the iron bars, not shaking them the way I might have expected, just holding them the way a person holds something solid when the ground beneath them has become unreliable. He had lost weight. His jacket was one I recognized from 2 years ago, not the current wardrobe which told me something about the state of his finances. His hair was uncombed. His face, even at this distance in the copper evening light, looked like the face of a man who had not been sleeping. He looked up and saw me in the window. His hands tightened on the bars. "Dad," he said. His voice broke on the word, not a clean break, but the kind of fracture that happens when something has been under pressure for too long and finally gives at its weakest point. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I know what I did. I know all of it. I'm not going to try to explain it or make it make sense because it doesn't make sense." His chest was rising and falling unevenly. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry for everything. For the text, for the money, for all of it. Please, Dad. Please just open the gate." I looked at my son, standing at the gate of the property I had built, with my hands over 3 years and my savings over 40, holding the iron bars in a jacket from 2 years ago, asking me to let him in. I thought about the September morning, when he had arrived with lukewarm coffee and a quote sheet, and left in 20 minutes with a check for $14,000. I thought about October when he had signed my name to a document without asking. I thought about the Thanksgiving crawl space and the rooftop dinner and 14 photographs of this property presented to strangers as evidence of his own success. I thought about the text message on a Wednesday morning in March. "Gerald needs the spotlight. Your presence would make things uncomfortable. We love you," and the 5 words I had typed back without hesitation. And I thought about a letter written in October of 2021 on ivory notepaper by a woman with careful handwriting and complete clarity about the people she loved. "Don't let your love become a burden on yourself. You are allowed to keep something just for you." I looked at Mason for a long moment. Long enough for him to understand that I had heard every word. Long enough for him to understand that I was not acting in haste or in anger. Long enough for him to understand that what was coming was considered. Then I said quietly and clearly in a voice that carried down the slope without difficulty in the still evening air. "You told me that my being there would make everything feel off, Mason." I paused. "I'm keeping things the way you wanted them. Perfect." His face changed. The rawness in it collapsed inward, the way a structure collapses when the last support is removed, not violently, but with the terrible completeness of something that has no remaining option but to fall. His hands slid from the bars. He took one step back from the gate. I closed the window. I stood in the upstairs hallway for a moment, with my hand still on the window latch, looking at the wall in front of me. The house was very quiet around me, the good solid quiet of walls that know what they are doing. My heart rate was steady. My hands were not shaking. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea. Through the window above the sink, I could see the gate at the bottom of the driveway. I heard the Audi's engine start. I heard it reverse down the gravel road. I heard it reach the county road at the bottom and turn not toward Los Angeles, I noticed. I did not know where he was going. That was no longer mine to know. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the roses were still blooming in the last of the copper light. The lake was going dark and smooth the way it did every evening at this hour, reliable as anything I had ever built. Pete called at 8. "I saw a car at your gate earlier," he said. "Black Audi." "I know," I said. A pause. "You all right?" I looked out the window at the dark lake. The first stars appearing above the eastern ridge, the roses still faintly visible as shapes against the south fence in the last of the light. "Yes," I said. "I am." And I meant it completely, in a way I had not meant anything completely in a very long time. June came in slowly and stayed. The attorney drove up from San Bernardino on a Thursday morning in the second week of the month, a quiet man named Hargrove, who had handled my estate documents for 12 years and knew better than to use more words than the work required. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with coffee between us and the lake visible through the window, doing what lakes do when serious men are working nearby, which is simply continuing to exist without comment. I amended the will. Removing Mason entirely, which Hargrove confirmed, required nothing more than my signature and his notarization under California law. No court appearance, no extended process, no drama of any kind. 40 years of accumulated work redirected with the stroke of a pen and the quiet scratch of a notary stamp. The entirety of the estate, the property, the savings, the Big Bear Lake land, and every nail and beam and stone I had put into it across 3 years of weekends would pass into a charitable trust administered by Natalie. The trust had a name, the Donna Greer Scholarship Fund. Established to support students pursuing careers in the building trades, carpentry, electrical, plumbing, masonry. The work that builds things that last. The work that cannot be faked because the structure either stands or it does not. And the building tells the truth about the builder every single time. I had asked Natalie if she thought Donna would have approved. Natalie had looked at me over her reading glasses with her father's expression and said without hesitation, "She would have thought of it herself if you hadn't." That settled it. Hargrove left before noon. I signed the civil harassment restraining order paperwork the same afternoon, which Natalie had prepared with her usual precision and filed with San Bernardino County Superior Court by end of business. The order established a formal legal perimeter around the property and around my person, meaning that Mason could not approach either without consequence. It was not a punishment. It was simply a boundary drawn clearly and recorded officially, the way all boundaries worth keeping should be. Then it was done. All of it. Every piece of it. I walked out to the dock alone after Hargrove's car disappeared down the road and stood at the end of it for a while with my hands in my pockets, looking at the water. The lake was very still. The roses along the south fence were at their fullest deep red, exactly as Donna had planned them, their fragrance coming up the slope in the warm June air with the unhurried confidence of things that have been tended well and know it. I thought about 40 years of work. I thought about a woman who grabbed my arm from a car window and said, "That's it." I thought about a letter written on ivory paper that had waited 3 years in a nightstand drawer for the right morning. I thought about how long it had taken me to understand that love is not the same thing as limitlessness, that a man who gives everything without condition does not become more loved. He simply becomes easier to take. Pete came by that evening with a six-pack of beer he had been saving for what he called the right occasion. We carried 2 bottles down to the dock and sat on the bench as the sun went behind the western ridge and the lake turned from gold to silver to the deep, quiet blue of a mountain evening in early summer. "You know what the best part of building something is, Pete," I said. He thought about it genuinely, the way Pete thought about everything. "What's that, getting to decide who gets to enjoy it?" Pete smiled. He raised his bottle. I raised mine. We sat on that dock until the stars came out, 2 old men with cold beer and warm silence, and a lake that had never once asked anything of either of us except to be looked at. That was enough. That was exactly enough. If this family story taught me anything, it is this: love without boundaries is not love. It is a slow erosion of everything you built. I spent years believing that giving more would eventually be enough. It never was. Looking back honestly, I should have drawn the line far earlier. Do not wait until the signature on the document is not yours. Do not wait until you are eating alone on Thanksgiving while your son photographs someone else's table. If someone you love is using your generosity as a foundation for a life built on appearances, speak up. Walk away sooner than I did. Your peace is worth protecting before it is gone. God has a way of returning things to their rightful place. The lake is still here. The roses still bloom. And I am still here, which at 68 feels like more than enough. These grandpa stories are not just mine. They belong to every father who ever gave everything and wondered if it was seen. This family story is for you. You are not alone. If these grandpa stories moved something in, you share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you never miss another family story worth carrying with you. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories shared on this channel contain fictionalized elements crafted for reflection and inspiration. If this kind of content is not for you, we respect that. Please explore other videos that may serve you better.